So good evening. I am so honored to be part of this critically important lecture series. And so I want to begin by thanking Father Peter and for also Father Kevin for creating a variety of ways for the Villanova community to face and grapple with racial inequality in our country and also in our church. I think you are using your institutional resources to serve the common good, and I see you all doing that, and I thank you for doing that. I also want to thank Dr. Tia Noel Pratt, not only for the invitation to be here this evening, but more importantly, Tia, for being a colleague and a friend and an accountability partner in what you fondly call, or maybe not so fondly, but call in all caps, the work of racial justice and equity. I know that my whiteness has come at a cost to you at different points in our friendship, intellectually, spiritually, and personally. And so I'm really grateful to you for the ways that you help me get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I'm also really grateful for the opportunity this evening to meet Sister Rita and Sister Annette of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, whose congregation was founded by Sister Lange and who were here to uplift and whose memory we stand in. So it was really wonderful, wonderful opportunity to get to know you a little bit over dinner. And I look forward to future conversations and hopefully collaborations. I want to begin by saying I have a lot of roots here at Villanova. I first discovered and was supported in my vocation as a theologian right here. I took my first graduate course in theology, Foundations in Theology, with Dr. Tony Gadziba. Dr. Bernie Prusak served up my first Christological epiphanies, and I found the practical side to theology thanks to ethicists like Dr. Walter Kahn and Dr. Sue Toten. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the formation as a theologian I received during my time in the graduate program here. My family roots at Villanova predate all of that. Despite sending his 3 children to St. Joseph's University, my father, George, is a proud alum of both the undergraduate program and the law school, class of 66 and 69, respectively. And uncles on both my mother's and my father's side were here before my dad. And he and my mom, Kathleen, who are watching by Zoom at home this evening, were married in Villanova's chapel 51 years ago. So as I perused your Rooted Project website, I was confronted by what is now a familiar sensation, one that I plan to unpack with you a bit more this evening. I was caught off guard once again by the realization that my family's story across 5 generations in Catholic Philadelphia is tangled up in the history of other Philadelphia Catholics, Black Philadelphia Catholics like William and Julia Molden. As you probably know, the Moldens lived on and worked this corner of Radnor Township before the Augustinians arrived. William was born into indentured servitude and bought his own freedom a few years before his owners, the Randolphs, would have been required by Pennsylvania's abolition laws to free him. He and Julia were among the first people to financially support the construction of the chapel, where my chapter in my family story certainly got its start. And they donated land on which I first learned how to engage my Catholic tradition as a scholar. That familiar sensation of being confronted by a history that is actually in plain view goes something like this. Wow, this is so fascinating. Wait, why am I only just now learning about this? What impact has the silence about these remarkable people had on me and other white Catholics? What impact has that silence had on the descendants of the Moldens and other Black Catholics in Philadelphia like them? Could there be a connection between then and now? Between their circumstances then and my circumstances now? What am I supposed to do with all of this knowledge? So here's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to tell you why I decided to, using the words of your own Rooted project, to tell a new story of my family based in fact and aimed at justice. That's what your Rooted project is about. I'm going to share 3 knots of American Catholic anti-Blackness I discovered, paying particular attention to the protagonism of Black women, like the namesake of this lecture. Black Catholic women who named the knots of their own times and attempted to undo them. And I'll share what I continue to learn since the book came out. My book came out 18 months ago, and I'll offer a few recommendations for how I think we can remain rooted in this history and aim at justice by undoing some of the knots we're tangled up in. So I need to start with the archival experience that confirmed for me that there was a history here just waiting to be told. That's my mom, Kathleen, on her first communion day, around the time this story I'm about to tell you unfolded. So in 1940, my maternal grandfather, William Gallagher, who was 4F'd from serving in World War II, moved his family, my grandmother, Catherine, and 3 kids at the time, including my mom, from the West Oak Lane section of North Philadelphia to a 200-acre property in Jeffersonville, Montgomery County. Big Bill, as he was called by his buddies, was a schemer, and his latest brainchild was to grow a crop of 200 Cape Cod-style houses in a subdivision he named Burnside Estates. So there he is on the building site, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a picture of my grandfather without a cigarette in his hand, so keep your eye on that. My mom and her siblings spent about 4 years on the farm, as they called it, in a farmhouse at the heart of that harvest of homes. I heard lots of stories about those years on the farm, but not much about the subdivision itself. How did my grandfather finance that operation? Who did he sell his houses to? Or who didn't he sell them to? After all, Big Bill was just ahead of what sociologists have called the Homestead Act of the 20th century, the racialization of the American suburbs through federally mandated and financed housing segregation. Richard Rothstein, the author of Color of Law, advised me to track down an advertisement for Burnside Estates. If the ad mentioned FHA approved or VA funding available, then it would not have been legal for Big Bill to sell to anyone other than white buyers. So off I went on my first archival excursion for this project. I headed to the Montgomery County Historical Society to see what I could find in the Norristown Times-Herald. I made a guess. I thought 1950 would be a good place to start looking for this ad. So I threaded my first roll of microfilm into the machine, January to June 1950. There wasn't even a real estate section in newspapers at that point. And as I was scrolling through January and then February, I got midway through March when my eyes caught the name of the Gallagher's new parish in Jeffersonville, St. Francis of Assisi. I scrolled back and I sharpened the focus, and here's what I saw. Basically, Mom in a minstrel show. So this was a fundraising event that happened on St. Patrick's Day in 1950 in St. Francis of Assisi Parish. And if you notice with the red arrows there, I point out I was able to scroll in and find my uncle's name and my mother's name, both listed among the performers. And then on the far side, you'll see I also note that this was definitely a minstrel show that involved blackface, because you'll notice that there is a makeup crew, and it's all men in the makeup crew. So this was a blackface minstrel show in a parish hall in the suburbs of Philadelphia on St. Patrick's Day of 1950. I went looking for an ad to prove racial segregation in the residential neighborhood my grandfather was building, and instead found my mom and my uncle in a parish St. Patrick's Day fundraising minstrel show. I felt in that moment as though this was a history that was just patiently waiting for me to find it and tell it. I had that sensation, wow, wait, what? Now what? I wasn't planning on minstrel shows being part of my family history. I wasn't planning on learning how white Catholics brought this practice with them from city parishes to suburbs, like St. Stephen's Parish that the Gallaghers had left behind in North Philly to St. Francis of Assisi in Norristown. Blackface minstrelsy was a way of marking spaces, both the profane space of the neighborhood, but also the sacred space of the parish halls where they were performed as white-only spaces. I had to name this performance of as a performance of Catholic white supremacy. Here were parishioners in St. Francis insisting that St. Francis of Assisi and the archdiocese to which it belonged, Burnside Estates and the suburb to which it belonged, were designed for and intended to serve white people, and more explicitly, white Catholics. Not only that, but this St. Patrick's Day minstrel show was a performance of anti-Blackness, beliefs, stories, practices, and policies that insist that there is something wrong with Black people, that Black people are a problem, that Black people, including Black Catholics, are a liability to our neighborhoods, a liability to our parishes. My mother witnessed all of that as a kid. So again, I wasn't planning on finding this history, but I had, and it confirmed my sense that the roots of racism went deep in the soil of Philadelphia Catholicism. 3 different situations, though, that were unfolding in my own life, all in different Catholic contexts in Philadelphia, really spurred me to go digging around on the shadow side of my family's otherwise one-dimensional family tree on Ancestry.com. So I want to tell you about why I wrote the book. The first time my muse for the book visited me, I was standing on the corner of 13th and Erie in North Philadelphia in front of a mural called Forgiveness. I had been to that mural many times. It's on one of the stops that I make on various pilgrimages I offer, mostly for white Catholic pilgrims, of our city's many faith-based community murals. On that particular afternoon, and I think it was because I had my back to the mural, I wasn't facing the mural, but my back was to the mural, and I was looking out at the folks who were with me, I realized that my maternal grandmother, Catherine Gallagher, Big Bill's wife, had grown up just cat-a-corner to the mural on 13th and Erie. This was her neighborhood, her block, her corner. This had been the epicenter of my family's life back in the 1920s. St. Stephen's Parish, just a few blocks away on Broad and Butler, had been the epicenter of their Catholic life, until all of a sudden it wasn't. I knew the history of racial residential segregation, but I found myself wondering about the impact of that sudden exodus on my family members. How did they rationalize their departure from neighborhoods and parishes in which they were so deeply invested? Churches that they had built and contributed out of their own meager finances to maintain, to beautify. How did they justify the choice to leave in light of what they surely knew to be the racialized incentives behind it? What relationships got ruptured? What was handed to them by previous generations that helped them make that decision and justify it? How did they explain it to their kids? What was handed on from those kids, my mom, to their kids, me? Did they go on to use that same moral calculus in making other decisions? My second muse prompting coincided with Pope Francis's visit to Philadelphia back in 2015. I'm wondering if anybody here participated in any way in the papal visit in 2015, just wondering. So I see a smattering of hands. It was a big deal when Pope Francis came to Philadelphia. I participated by leading a pilgrimage from LaSalle at Broad and Olney all the way down to the Parkway for the papal mass. We stopped at a variety of holy sites, including Forgiveness and other churches like St. Stephen's along the way. At that time, I was also working with Faith in Action, a national network of community organizers, to encourage Philadelphia parishes to join POWER, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild, which was Faith in Action's local affiliate in Philadelphia. We were trying to encourage Philadelphia parishes to join Power as a way of embracing Pope Francis's vision of a church where those at the center seek to be in relationship with those on the margins, as well as his vision of leaders of social movements as the poets of our time. I worked with a small team of other Catholics to use Catholic social teaching and personal encounters with people impacted by social problems facing our city as tools for convincing parishes to join Power. After nearly a year-long effort, no additional parishes joined the meager 3 who were already members. And I found myself wondering what makes Catholics in our city so hesitant to address root causes of the social inequality gripping our city. A little time spent in the knotted grotto in front of the basilica that was created for the Pope's visit had me wondering, as I allowed all of those knots of the people of our city and pilgrims to kind of wash over me, I found myself wondering if racism is what's keeping us from addressing racism. And finally, my muse showed up in the classroom in the fall of 2016. I was teaching a class on theology and racism, and we were a racially diverse group, evenly split between white students and students of color, with Black students being the majority of students of color. We had done important work of building trust, of getting to know one another. And as I was watching it all fall apart as we began to debate the All Lives Matter response to the Black Lives Matter lament and affirmation, I literally saw all of that relational work start to fade away. And a Black student broke through the tension with a simple and yet weighty request. When it comes to racism, he said, I just wish people would believe me. So again, I found myself wondering, why is it so hard for white Catholics to believe our brothers and sisters of color? We were in a classroom in a Catholic university, after all, and it still was not easy to believe. What gets in the way? What have we inherited that makes it so difficult to let go of the familiar tropes and frameworks and actually believe our brothers and sisters of color? So I decided to find my family's story, figure out how it is that I've landed in this place and what I've inherited that is either making it possible for me to engage in meaningful ways around racial equity and justice, or what's holding me back. And I decided to do so through a penitential practice that my Irish ancestors would have been familiar with. It's called rounding. After confession, Irish Catholics were told to go find a holy place somewhere in nature, like this one, an ancient passage burial tomb that predates the pyramids in County Sligo, where some of my people are from. Penitents were encouraged to walk in circles as part of their penance, circling that holy space until they felt loosened from the bonds of sin, until they felt ready to go back to their life. So I decided to round all of the parishes, sometimes physically, but all archivally, in order to be able to put my finger on the dynamics in those spaces that have contributed to my self-understanding as a white Catholic Philadelphian. In all of my rounding, I found these 5 knots. And I'm committed to trying to undo all of them and also listen and learn from folks and add to this list. So I'm hoping we'll have time to add to this in light of your own experience. I'm only gonna have time tonight to tell you about 3 of them. And again, I'm hoping you'll add a bit. So the first one I want to tell you about is the knot of performing white supremacy. And this takes us back to St. Stephen's Parish on my mother's side of the family. So this story involves the Hargadens, who are shown here in a photo taken in 1924 or 1925. And I'm bringing them into the space in a special way because I'm wearing tonight I'm wearing a medal that the youngest, who's pictured Marty, who's pictured there on my great-grandmother Belinda's lap, he would go on to become a Franciscan friar of the Atonement and work in the Vatican during the Second Vatican Council. And he bought my great-grandmother this medal when he was in Rome. And it just came to me through one of my mother's cousins. And so I'm invoking them in this space. These were obviously very, very committed Catholics. The family lore goes that that Marty was good buddies with John the 23rd. So we're going to claim that. I don't know how true that is, but we'll claim that as part of our story. Anyway, they lived in St. Stephen's Parish at Broad and Butler around the same time that the country, exactly at the same time that the country celebrated the sesquicentennial in 1926. We're actually getting ready to celebrate that again. I don't know what the words would be for the 250th anniversary of the country, but in 1926, preparing to celebrate the sesquicentennial. Joseph Doherty was the cardinal at that time. And I love this picture of him because I just was, panning through different parish bulletins, and somebody had just cut out a picture of him from the bulletin and put it into one of the parish calendars. And I love that. I think it says he's just back from vacation in, where was he? In Barbados. So he's just back from vacationing in Barbados. But anyway, he was a definitive leader of the diocese, so much so that in the spring, early spring of 1926, he got some correspondence from one of his priests out in the far northeast in the Croydon section of the city. And the parish there had a shrine that had been burned by the KKK, St. Thomas Aquinas Parish out in Croydon. And there were flyers that were going up all over that part of the city, really denouncing Catholics, but also really targeting Doherty as a particular kind of leader that the KKK had problems with. I had no idea that there was Klan activity in the city of Philadelphia, but Philadelphia actually was a hotbed of Klan activity. The head of the Clavern in Philadelphia actually lived in Narberth, not far from all of you out here, right? So as Doherty is getting these messages about the KKK harassing and inciting violence up in the far northeast, he's also learning that the Klan had hoped to have what they were calling a convocation during the sesquicentennial celebration. They wanted to have a big march and then a big rally. And their application had been accepted, and it was sort of in the works until the very last minute when some of the Jewish businessmen, prominent Jewish businessmen in the city, threatened to withdraw their financial support of the sesquicentennial, that the decision to disinvite the Klan was offered at the very last minute. But there was this sort of gap in the program. And so Doherty really devised a pretty remarkable feat. And he held a mass, a sesquicentennial mass in October of 1926 for 250,000 in the city of Philadelphia, in the Sesqui Stadium. And not only that, but he orchestrated 80,000 men walking down South Broad Street, so from City Hall down to where the sports stadiums are right now. So imagine 80,000 men walking shoulder to shoulder, some of them dressed in really fancy attire. You see them walking underneath this giant replica of the Liberty Bell that hung at the beginning of the fairgrounds. There's a great picture of them walking side by side. I'm pretty confident that I had family members who were in this massive group of 80,000 men. Here's a picture of some of the pomp and circumstance of Cardinal Doherty entering the sesquicentennial stadium to a crowd of 250,000 with 10,000 in an overflow mass outside that was celebrated by the Hargaden's own pastor at St. Stephen's. So again, a pretty remarkable feat. But I can't help but think was also mimicking or mirroring the very thing that the Klan was hoping themselves to do by organizing a march of white Catholic men down Broad Street. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So I would think, and again, as I said, I'm confident that I had family members who were engaged in this. I'm probably brushing shoulders with future family members since every parish in the archdiocese was represented. But they wouldn't necessarily have brushed shoulders, the men in my family would not have brushed shoulders with Black Catholics, because an internal memo that I found in some of the notes in the archives around the sesquicentennial clearly indicates, and I'm thinking maybe you can see it, but the predominantly Black Catholic parishes are labeled there with a C for colored. So you can see the way in which orchestrating, they were already identified and sort of in a way that some of the other ethnic parishes would not have been, the remaining ethnic parishes at that time. And then all of the parishes, the Black parishes, folded into the parade towards the back. So it wasn't like they were sprinkled on different streets, around that parade. They were all at the back of the parade, which meant that when they arrived in the Sesquicentennial Stadium, they were also in the back of the stadium. So while that is all unfolding, again, I'm in Cardinal Doherty's archives, I'm in his correspondence, looking around just to see what I could find, and I unexpectedly find this piece, this letter, this set of letters that was written to Cardinal Doherty by 3 women of St. Peter Claver Parish, the first Black Catholic parish established here in the city. Rosa White, Gertrude Palmer, and Clara Baptiste Jones twice reached out to Cardinal Doherty, first in that handwritten note that you see, and then a few weeks later in a typed one. They had been selected to represent Black Catholics at the Sesqui exhibit in one of the exhibit halls, and they wanted Cardinal Doherty's advice and counsel for moving forward. Their desire to be part of the Sesqui on their own terms points that there were other expressions beyond just white Catholicism that were seeking to be exhibited during the Sesqui. But you'll notice that Doherty twice dismissed them through his secretary, whose last name was O'Hara, who scrawled in pencil at the bottom of both letters saying, these people were to be told that the Archbishop wants no hand in this matter. So the takeaways, as I processed this, was that at a critical moment in American history and in American Catholic history, a choice was made to join in performances of white supremacy, mimic them even, rather than engage in racial solidarity among Catholics in Philadelphia, because the Klan both targeted Black people but also Catholics. This was a moment for coalition building. This was a moment for bridge building, and it was passed. So what we saw instead was alignment with Catholicism and insistence on the U.S. as a white Christian nation, and the role of Catholicism as solidly embedded in that Christian identity of the U.S. And also, I see here attending to anti-Catholicism. Catholics and Doherty were targeted by the Klan, but responding to that through the shared American value of anti-Blackness. The best way to duck the Klan was to participate in the wider culture's devaluation of Black people. So what impact did that have on my people, who, again, I have every reason to believe participated in those festivities, whether walking as fathers and sons down Broad Street or participating as mothers and daughters in the Sesqui Mass? Who knows, maybe this medal was at the Sesqui Mass. No, it wouldn't have been yet. Sorry, got ahead of myself. Here's what my family learned. They learned that the best defense is a strong offense. They learned that the best response to fear is to create an insular sense of conditional belonging, in this case, conditional on race. You belong if you're white. They also learned that Catholic patriotism involves expressing the supremacy of Catholicism among other Christian denominations and laying the groundwork for Catholic ascendancy to political power at the national level. So what's the legacy of this knot? In Philadelphia, the erasure of these 3 women from St. Peter Claver Parish was a harbinger of things to come for that parish. The Archdiocese officially closed it in 1995, and then 19 years later closed the St. Peter Claver Center for Evangelization that was housed in the property. Today, the descendants of the parish and advocates for Black Catholicism in the city are in the midst of a lawsuit to preclude the Archdiocese from selling the property to a non-Catholic entity in hopes of bringing it under private Catholic control. But the outcome of that is far from certain, and the wounds of a century of rejecting the gifts of Black Catholicism remain exposed and unhealed. So let's move to a second knot, a knot that I call the preferential option for the institutional church. So I want to fast forward a decade I'm still in my own research, I'm still in Cardinal Doherty's correspondences, trying to track those three ladies from St. Peter Claver, see if anything surfaces, and I come across another letter. This one originally sent to Brother Anselm, who was the president of LaSalle University in 1937. And the issue is about LaSalle's refusal to admit Black Catholic students to LaSalle, especially two Black Catholic students who are graduates of West Catholic, which was a high school that the Christian Brothers helped to run in West Philly. The Cardinal had an expectation that every high school student attend a Catholic college, but the admissions policies at LaSalle were making that really difficult. So you can see in this letter that was written by and sent by the secretary of the Philadelphia chapter of the Federated Black Catholics, Ethel Lee, another really strong Black Catholic female protagonist for racial equity and justice. Basically, the Federated Black Catholics were founded in 1924 by a Dr. Wyatt Turner down in DC, and the group was committed to addressing issues of racial inequality, particularly in education systems. So you can read some excerpts from this very strongly written letter from Ethel Lee and her colleagues in the Federated Colored Catholics chapter in Philadelphia. They say, "We take this opportunity to call your attention to the gross injustice of your procedure to not accept these two students, both whom were ready to pay in cash and one who had received a scholarship at West Catholic in the Cardinal's name." And they go on to say, "Since the example you have set in these instances serves but to prolong racial misunderstandings, since such conduct is far removed from the principles on which your noble order was founded, and since such procedure deprives Catholic Negroes of an opportunity to secure Catholic higher education, and such action is in contrast to the tenets of Christian social justice," so they're already invoking the gradually evolving Catholic social tradition at this point in 1937. "We register this protest as un-Catholic and un-Christian." And then they say, "Please don't make us tell the Archbishop. Figure out how to get this supported, the Cardinal. Please don't let us have to turn to the Cardinal." So then I talked about this with a colleague at LaSalle. Oh, and here's Ethel Lee's signature, right? The Federated Colored Catholics. A bold and courageous and fiercely loyal Catholic woman. So a colleague of mine at LaSalle then went kind of hunting around in our own archives and found this excerpt from the college council minutes a few weeks later, right, where they say the question of admitting Catholic Negroes into LaSalle College was brought up for discussion. This was after they talked about whether or not they could have a Spanish major, and it was talked about, it was sort of the third thing on the docket at that meeting. As there has been a case of a Catholic graduate of West Catholic High being refused, the question was considered important if similar cases should arrive and possibly reach the ears of His Eminence. Just now, the Interracial College Association is soliciting aid of Catholic colleges on behalf of the Catholic Negro. Please note that there were college students who were organizing themselves for racial equity and justice in something called the Interracial College Association. Some students desired the admittance of Black students. It was the general opinion of the council that a favorable attitude should be adopted if the Catholic Negro meets all of the college entrance requirements, right? So what did people learn? What did white Catholics attending colleges and universities at that time learn? First, we learned that Black students are a liability to the institution. We also learned that there is an expectation for Black Catholics to assimilate to the standards and the culture of the institution. And third, we learned to be motivated for action out of fear of punishment rather than out of recognizing the full dignity of the students. So we could ask questions about the legacy of this. We remain tangled in this knot when we consider the obstacles many Black and brown students face in college admissions, particularly right here in Philadelphia. While the number of college students from underserved populations has increased, that's largely due to for-profit institutions, as well as less financially secure institutions changing admissions policies. Prestigious institutions like this one remain out of reach. And you can see that captured in this Inquirer story from 2021 about the disproportionate numbers of Black and brown students admitted into our institutions. Moreover, we know that once admitted, students still face challenges of predominantly white Catholic cultures in our institutions. And I would imagine that there is a fair amount of conversation and activism about that on your campus as there was on my campus in the past few years. So the preferential option for the institution, opting for the financial viability and sustainability of the institution at the expense of the people that the institution is serving. So I want to conclude with one more about my alma mater, and this is actually my story. So in 2016, the New York Times released and did an expose about the history of Georgetown University in 1848, selling 272 people who were owned by the Jesuits in Maryland into two slave owners, Catholic slave owners in Louisiana. And this made a big splash in 2016. And a colleague of mine at Fordham, who I used to teach with at Fordham, called me on the phone and she was like, "Maureen, have you seen this?" And I looked at it and I was like, oh, I actually knew that. When I was a senior history major at St. Joseph's University, in my history seminar and final project, my professor, I was struggling, as I'm sure students are familiar with this. I don't know what I'm going to do. What could I do for the senior thesis? I don't know what to do for my senior thesis. And my professor at the time, Randall Miller, said, well, Miss O'Connell, because he was kind of one of those more formal types of faculty members, he's like, Miss O'Connell, there is a very interesting diary down in the archives at Georgetown University that was kept by an overseer, a Jesuit brother overseer on the plantations in Maryland. Maybe you should go down and check that out. So as a dutiful student, I did, and I'm really grateful to my mother for keeping our family archive so intact on the third floor of our former house, because I was able to call up my mom, and I went over to the third floor and I dug around in the boxes and I found my notes from November of 1994, where I had gone into the archives at Georgetown and clearly found, again, sort of hidden in plain sight, this history. So you can see my notes, they're pretty extensive. There's my abstract, here's what I propose to do, here's what I'm gonna look at. I remember having to wear white gloves and I had to do all of my work in pencil because you were not allowed to have pens in the archive. You can see I redrew the map of the plantation, and I went through my notes and again, found in my notes where I knew in 1994 that 272 people had been sold by the Jesuits. And I was not the only one to discover this. This was information and knowledge that the Jesuits themselves had known and had written about and had talked about. So it was not a surprise necessarily to them. I'll show you my final paper. You can see the professor really had some things to say about and I only got a B+. I went all the way to Georgetown to an archive as a senior in college. But I think I'm really struck by my second to last sentence in that text. I say, theoretically, St. Joseph's College, established in 1851, was established in part as a result of the sale of the Jesuits' previous plantations, such as San Inigo's in St. Mary's County, Maryland. Just this past weekend at the Ignatian Solidarity Network, Teach-In for Justice, some in the room were there. One of the keynote speakers Monique Trusclair Maddox, who's a CEO of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, said pretty much the same thing, acknowledged that that sale of those folks was not just to save Georgetown University, but was really to help finance the Jesuits project in the United States. So I am dumbfounded by the fact that I knew this information and I was able to forget about this information. And that I was able to forget about it not only as an undergraduate, but I was able to forget about it when I did master's work here at Villanova, and then I was able to forget about it. I didn't even remember it doing my doctoral work at Boston College in ethics. The fact that I was able to so clearly forget this as a theologian, I mean, if there was anybody who maybe would remember it, you would think it might be people in the church who are committed to ethics in the church. And where I was even doing racial justice and equity work at that time already, and I forgot that I knew this, right? I think, what did I learn? I think I learned that unless we're in communities where this history is not just somebody's history, but somebody else's story, it's just really easy for the rest of us to find it interesting and then file it away in our own either mental archive, or in my case, like in my archive in my family home, right? And so I think there was not a place in our curriculum for me to explore this further. There wasn't a place for me to go with the questions that this asked for me. My institution was not sufficiently populated, or there weren't people in my community for whom this would have been their family history or something similar to it, right? It just was an interesting historical fact that got me the grade that I needed to get the degree that I wanted. So what's the legacy of this? I think our church is still living with this legacy. Jesuit institutions for sure are still living with this legacy. The GU 272, the Descendants, is now thousands of people, and there's more people every day that are part of the descendants of the sale of 272 people. But the one thing that I think we can all take from what they have said is that they want nothing done about them without them. Nothing about us without us has been their consistent mantra. Even there is a diversity of perspectives and opinions on what should be done in terms of reparations, in terms of reconciliation. So I think we have done much in our institutions and in our classrooms and in our research, in our ministries about Black people and Black Catholics, but certainly not in a way that centers them. I don't know that my research centers on Black people, or that honors their agency, or puts them in a position to teach the rest of us a more accurate history, which is why a lecture series like this is so important. So let me just conclude by telling you a little bit about what I continue to learn, and a couple next steps that I think we could take, and then I'm very eager to hear your questions. When the publication date for this book started to draw near, my anxiety really, really spiked. I was really, really anxious about this book coming out. I was like, well, that was a really great idea. Whose idea was it to do a book with Catholic anti-Blackness, and the title about one's own family? I was really worried about what I missed, but more importantly, about who I missed, about what I got wrong, about what historians would think. I'm not a historian. I was one as an undergrad, but I'm trained as an ethicist. Would angry family members that I didn't even know, who I've identified now through this extensive work in our family tree, would they materialize and take issue with me sharing this history without speaking with them? So I was really worked up. And a wise person put my exposed psyche at rest with these words. She said, once the book is out in the world, it becomes your teacher through the people who engage it. And that really has been true. And I think is a really good lesson for those of us who feel a lot of anxiety about engaging in racial justice work. We have to allow the people we engage with to become our teachers. So I want to share with you a few things I've learned, right? So first, we all have stories like this that we are yearning to tell. For many white Catholics that I've encountered since this book has come out, telling these stories has almost a confessional feel or dimension to them. I have heard from so many people who have a desire to be liberated, and by this I mean white Catholics, who have a desire to be liberated from fear and guilt and shame in order to embrace the emotions we need for social change work, emotions like humility and being comfortable with discomfort, and being willing to acknowledge just how much we don't know or we don't understand. I've also heard from so many people who are doing their own quiet work to uncover family histories, or parishes who are attempting to tell the truth in their own claims, or trying to tell the truth so that their own claims about being an inclusive community ring true. I see Villanova University attempting to do this in your Rooted website. We need spaces to tell these stories. We need spaces to receive these stories. We need spaces to get curious about and challenge the stories that we have been handed down that might not be so accurate and might not be so complete. Second, as I mentioned at the outset, histories of enslavement and the afterlife of slavery are closer to all of us than we think. I had an aha moment like that just this time last year when a member of a panel on my book up at Boston College, Dr. Jamie Waters, who's a scripture scholar there in the School of Theology and Ministry, she was on the panel, and she revealed in our conversation on that panel that our great-grandmothers were likely parishioners together at the Jesu Parish in North Philadelphia in the 1940s. At that time, my great-grandparents, this is on my dad's side, were among some of the only remaining white members of the parish. Jamie's description, however, of the Jesu as a bastion of vibrant Black Catholicism in the Archdiocese certainly challenged the narratives I read about fear of decay and decline, or the parish as a mission church that largely depended on the charitable works and donations from more white and wealthy parishes. When we dig into our stories, we learn about ourselves through the eyes of others. We perceive our present reality from different perspectives. And we find courageous examples of many Black and even some white Catholics who embodied their faith in an inspiring loyalty and confidence that we can be better than we are. And finally, I've learned that if I could add a knot to my list, it would be the knot of clericalism, in light of the history of clerical white supremacy here in the Archdiocese. And by this, I mean not just perpetuating cultures that value those who have received holy orders above all others, but the valuing of white priests, even among that group of ordained Catholics, as well as approaches to the priesthood and priestly formation, which reinforce defensive postures against what is seen as different or those calling for change. So let me conclude by offering 3 next steps that I think we in Catholic higher education in particular can take in order to undo some of our knots. First, we gotta get curious enough to name them. And to do that requires creating spaces, I've already said this, that allows curiosity to flourish. And we need to be attentive to the ways in which homogenous communities narrow or even dampen our curiosity. We can increase our curiosity by amplifying the perspectives and backgrounds of the folks who come from different perspectives and traditions, and follow their lead in asking questions. Questions like, what don't we know? Where are the silences in our history? What is the personal impact of that silence? What could we imagine together? We can create curious spaces in our classrooms, in our parishes, in our public spaces on campus where it's okay to ask those questions. It's okay not to have immediate answers. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to make mistakes, because we're gonna keep rounding in that penitential practice those stories, and we're gonna keep asking our questions. We're gonna stay open, we're gonna stay curious. Second, I think we can loosen the grip of Catholic anti-Blackness by trying to get into relationship with each other as people, and not simply as people with pasts or people with ideologies or people with political or ecclesial preferences, but people with stories about what it's like to be us, what it's like to be you, what it's like to be me in our racialized society. I'm not talking about sharing our intellectual positions on race theory or our interpretations of this particular historic moment or about theological doctrine. We've got to risk sharing what it's like to be us in a racialized society and church. This is one way that we might get past the things that keep us disconnected from each other and maybe even disconnected from our own selves, so that we can get into relationship around the things that matter to us and stay connected when tensions surface, and trust each other that we'll show up for each other when it counts. I heard a colleague and a member of your own faculty put it this way earlier this week. JC Joseph, I think she was here. We have to invest in building relationships so we can bear the weight of the tension that comes when we get real with one another. Relationships create accountability, which is what our brothers and sisters of color need most from us. I also heard a student last week wisely say, ideology doesn't love you back. Anti-racism as a project or initiative doesn't motivate me to work for change the way that love of and for the Black people in my life does. Finally, I think we've got to take advantage of the global synod that Pope Francis launched 2 years ago to turn the relationships created by sharing of ourselves into strategies for structural change in our church. We have already seen evidence of structural change arising from the synod process. A Black Catholic woman, Dr. Cynthia Bailey Manns of Minneapolis, St. Paul, was selected by the North American Synod team, so by Canadians and by folks in the US, and by Pope Francis as one of only 10 Catholics from the US and Canada to serve as one of the 363 voting delegates in the General Assembly of Bishops this past month in Rome. Her leadership in her diocese around racial equity and LGBTQ inclusion were just 2 of the reasons she was chosen. But the inclusion of women, and a woman of color at that, is a historic first for the church. This has never happened. Never have lay people had voting status in a global synod. This is a result, her inclusion is the result of the people of God around the world clamoring for both women's full participation in the life of the church, as well as the need to acknowledge the wound of racism the church has inflicted. We can address both of those things at the same time through the synod. I want to go back one slide and see this report was just released in English, I think on Monday. This is from the synthesis report of the delegates in Rome last month, and you can see that there is consensus around the world for the need to address, please note, the systemic and institutional causes of racism in our church. Again, a really significant acknowledgement on the part of the global church, and no doubt as a result of having people of color, women of color, and a Black Catholic woman from the United States in that room for those conversations. In the synod, I think we can find a Catholic approach to anti-racism that balances calls for personal conversion, which we have heard from our bishops, through encounters in conversation in the Spirit. The synod is about listening to what the Holy Spirit is revealing to you and what the Holy Spirit is revealing to us and what the Holy Spirit is trying to prompt all of us toward. It can balance the call for personal conversion with structural change that gets offered through communal discernment about the tensions in our church and pathways forward we can take together. Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe, who offered meditations for synod delegates throughout the assembly last month, noted to Chris Lamb, a reporter for The Tablet on Chris's podcast, I'm going to quote Father Radcliffe. He said, "We all have to be changed to be different as a church, as individuals, before we know what the structural or doctrinal changes should be. If there are evolutions to happen, they will happen, but you don't start off by asking what changes have to be made. It's only going to happen in any good, sane, and Catholic way if it springs out of love." And yet the delegates did not lose sight of the need for meaningful structural change around the issue of racism and called us, all of us, to identify and address systemic and institutional racism in and through communal discernment rooted deeply in the relational synodal process, which we get to continue to do together for a year. So I'll simply conclude by invoking again the memories of William and Julia Molden, whose fierce Catholicism and commitment to the vision of the Augustinians back in the 1840s certainly helped make my theological vocation possible, as well as the space in which I offer the fruits of that vocation here this evening, and you as a community in receiving them possible. And so I end by saying, all of you holy men and women, pray for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Connell. In our first year, Dr. Erin Rowe led us in conversation on the global presence of Black folks in our church. And last year, Father Brian Massengale offered us a lamentation on where Black folks in the U.S. stand today in the church. And I really think this is a wonderful bridge between those two, but also offering us a path forward in how we can achieve justice in our church. So thank you so much. So we do have time for a few questions.
Dr. O'Connell. O'Connell, sorry. I was born in 1940. I grew up in Bala, St. Matthias Parish. I went to St. Matthias Church for 8 years. In the late 1940s, I attended 2 minstrel shows put on in our parish hall by our parish. The most popular priest of the parish was the interlocutor. Would it help you if you asked this congregation, especially the older people, if their churches in this area or any area had minstrel shows and what they were like? I found it enormously funny, but that was what I was taught. Would it help you to ask this?
Sure. A show of hands. Anybody want to be bold enough to say or brave enough to say that this was something that happened? We also know it happened on college campuses. The LaSalle yearbooks are full during that time of folks engaging in blackface minstrelsy. Yeah. It was very common. It was a very common practice. And again, I think what I found interesting in the text is that suburbanization of cities like, of metro areas like Philadelphia offered Catholics an opportunity to recreate their Catholic experience, their Catholic communities. And it also offered an opportunity maybe to sort of interrupt some of those processes or practices and attempt something new. And at least in the case of St. Francis of Assisi, it was a practice that kept folks tethered to those parishes that they left behind. And there, I've read a number of different pieces. There's a way in which it was also about sort of working out for some Catholics the anger that they felt at being forced to migrate, which is actually not a really accurate story. White Catholics were incentivized in migrating by federal subsidies, and also the archdiocese building all sorts of, purchasing property and having all sorts of spaces ready for the creation of new parishes and new schools and new high schools. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being courageous enough to name that.
Hi, Maureen. Good to see you. Thank you.
Too, yeah.
As Sister Thea Bowman would say, for telling the true truth. I'm just wondering, I think I know the answer to this question, but I was just wondering if anybody from the Archdiocese has reached out to you to have a conversation about your book and to look for maybe some next steps in reconciliation.
Thank you for that great question. I can say that I was invited over the summer to give a little book talk to folks in the racial justice and equity. I might not be naming that parish that parish committee correctly, but at the Basilica of St. Peter's and Paul, there's a parish there, so I was invited by folks in the parish. And I've been in conversation with some of the folks, the lay people who are involved in the Archdiocese Racial Justice and Healing Commission, and that's been really fruitful. I will also need to own that I have not myself actively reached out or tried to engage the Archdiocese around this question, but I will say that thanks to the synod process, I feel that many of us in higher ed are in relationship with our Archbishop and are building relationships of trust and sharing out of story. And I would anticipate that there would be an openness and a willingness for that kind of engagement. And so I want to own that part of that is on me. It's not simply on the Archdiocese. But yeah, I think that I am the work that I want to do next around the synod, in addition to supporting women's full participation in the church, is to think about synodality as a tool for us. And precisely because it is about getting in relationship across the church, across the different levels of leadership and the structures of the church. So thanks for that great question. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a good one to hold me accountable.
Thank you. I will not be long. I have the pleasure or the pain of sitting on various finance councils across the Archdiocese. And I love the statement that you made concerning, if you want to say, how supportive people of my you are to their various parishes or whatever. Our business manager, we just had a finance council meeting, and we have our business manager actually is with our church, but at other churches as well. And he candidly made the comment that he wished he had people as supportive in his suburban parish as he did at this particular urban parish. Otherwise, our giving was higher than our suburban counterparts. And those statements are not heard by many. Again, I have that pleasure or pain of knowing the finances because of the various boards I sit on. But those stories are not told very often. It's this perception that, oh my goodness, here they come. That means the finances are going to go down, 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 down. When in this case, the business manager said, my goodness, he said, I wish I had people giving this much in the suburban parish. You only go by what you hear. And if no one's telling you the truth or the other story, etc., you don't know. You just have this assumption that here they come and the money's going to start going down, down, down. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. Thank you for that.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, ideas about Catholic grammar schools and high schools in the city being shuttered. You know, you rightly talked about the problems at the university level, but we've seen this now for the last couple of decades, whereas the schools in the suburbs are thriving, right? So we talk about accountability. What accountability do people in the suburbs have, or maybe even our universities, for the schools that are being closed on a regular basis in the city? The Catholic schools?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jerry. I would love to put that question to a group of people who'd be interested in it and do a synodal conversation about that, right? Share around a table personal stories about why that question might be important to them or their own experience or journey through some of those communities around our archdiocese, and discern together what might reparations, look like. Reparations is a future-oriented position or stance. It's a really tricky word and a challenging word, but there's a lot of possibility for creativity when it comes to figuring out perhaps how to respond to a problem, an issue like that. But The one thing I learned, Jerry, in doing this work was that we have arrived in this place because plans were made 100 years ago that would land us right in this place, right? That we fragmented and segregated racially our archdiocese. And we continue to have parishes and even high schools and universities be really inward focused and focused on their own sustainability with a kind of imperviousness to what's going on in the ecological, or excuse me, the ecclesial ecosystem around us. I'm at an institution that is not as financially viable as this one, right? We're already asking questions about, well, what would it mean for us to be in better, meaningful relationship with the people in the part of the city where we are? How might that actually help serve us in the long run, rather than being walled off and rather than being defensive, or rather than seeing our neighborhood as the liability? To your point earlier, you know, our neighborhood doesn't have to be a liability. Our neighborhood and being invested in it, engaged in it, might actually be the very thing that could sustain us. But I think we need some creative thinking around that. I really do. And I think we need to get in relationship with one another in order to, we have to stop competing with one another and get in relationship to start to allow that creativity to be unleashed, to maybe really listen to what the Holy Spirit might be calling us to in order to respond to that question. So I appreciate you asking it.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. O'Connell for a thoughtful, powerful lecture.